After my husband died, I forced myself to attend my sister's baby's first birthday party. I was still wearing my mourning clothes and expected to sit quietly in the corner. I did not expect my sister to stand up in front of 50 guests, hold up a legal document, and announce that her son was actually my late husband's child. She demanded half of my $950,000 house as his rightful inheritance. I just stared at the piece of paper she shoved in my face and burst out laughing, because there was one deeply personal medical secret about my husband that she had completely missed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated you. My name is Fiona, and I am 34 years old. I work as a senior cybersecurity analyst for a major financial institution. My days are spent hunting down digital fraud, exposing hackers, and protecting sensitive data. I am trained to spot anomalies, to find the lie hidden in a vast sea of information. But I never imagined I would need to use those very same skills against my own flesh and blood to protect my home and my sanity. 3 weeks ago, my husband Aaron died in a sudden tragic car accident. He was my rock, my equal partner, and my entire world. We had spent the last 8 years building a beautiful, secure life together in our custom-built 4-bedroom home. We had great careers and we had peace. We had everything except a child of our own. That was always a painfully sore subject for my family, especially my mother Beverly and my father Gordon. They never missed an opportunity to remind me that my younger sister Sabrina was the one providing them with the joy of grandchildren. Sabrina was 29 and the undisputed golden child of our family. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood, I was always treated like a disappointing investment. While I was pushed to pay my own way through college and relentlessly criticized for my unladylike interest in coding and computer networks, Sabrina was handed the world on a silver platter. My parents eagerly funded her expensive failed acting classes, paid the rent on her luxury downtown apartments, and currently subsidized her superficial life as a struggling social media influencer. When she got pregnant out of wedlock by a guy who disappeared before the ink dried on the birth certificate, my parents treated the event like royalty arriving. They bought her designer baby clothes, paid all her bills, and constantly threw her perfect motherhood in my face, comparing my quiet career to her vibrant life. So there I was, standing in Sabrina's backyard for baby Mason's first birthday party. The yard was filled with elaborate pastel balloon arches, an absurdly expensive catered buffet, and dozens of my parents' wealthy country club friends. I stood near the edge of the stone patio, clutching a cup of lukewarm water, feeling entirely out of place in my dark mourning clothes. The grief was still so fresh it physically hurt to draw breath into my lungs. But my parents had insisted I attend, telling me that Aaron would want me to support the family and stop wallowing in self-pity. I should have known the invitation was a carefully laid trap. About an hour into the party, Sabrina tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute. The light chatter in the yard died down immediately. She stepped up to the gift table, her face arranged in a mask of perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying clearly over the manicured lawn. "This past year has been a tremendous blessing, but also a time of deep, unimaginable tragedy for our family. As you all know, we recently lost my brother-in-law, Aaron." The crowd murmured their polite sympathies. Some people looked over at me with pitying glances. I just stared at the grass, wishing I could blend into the background. But Sabrina was not finished. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a crisp, white legal document. "I have been carrying a very heavy burden," she continued, wiping a fake tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. "Aaron and I shared a very special bond, a bond that went far beyond family. We found deep comfort in each other during a lonely, difficult time in his marriage." My head snapped up instantly. The yard went dead silent. I could hear my own heart pounding a furious rhythm in my ears. Sabrina looked directly at me, her eyes cold and triumphant, completely devoid of any real sadness. "Fiona, I am so sorry to do this publicly, but you have been avoiding my calls and texts. Mason is Aaron's biological son, and before Aaron died, he updated his will to ensure his true legacy and his only child was protected." She slapped the document down onto the gift table, right next to a pile of brightly wrapped toys. This will states that half of your $950,000 estate belongs to Mason, she announced, her voice ringing with greedy authority. I'm going to need you to sign the deed transfer by the end of the week so we can get this settled. I stood completely frozen. I was expecting someone to laugh, to step in and tell her to stop making such a sick, tasteless joke at a child's birthday party. Instead, my parents, Gordon and Beverly, stepped forward immediately, flanking Sabrina like hired bodyguards. My mother glared at me, her face twisted in a familiar sneer of disappointment. Do not make a scene, Fiona, my mother snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. Aaron always preferred Sabrina's vibrant, creative energy over your boring computer obsession. He confided in us months ago. He wanted a real family with life and joy. Just accept the truth and sign the house over so your nephew is provided for. My father crossed his arms, puffing out his chest to look intimidating. We have already spoken to a lawyer, he added gruffly. It is completely legal and binding. Do not fight us on this, or we will drag you through a very public, very humiliating court battle that will destroy your professional reputation. I looked at the three of them standing there in their expensive clothes, completely united in their vicious effort to destroy me and steal my home. They were actively using my dead husband's memory to justify their staggering greed. The sheer audacity of it all was so overwhelming, so utterly ridiculous that the tight burning knot of grief in my chest suddenly gave way to something else entirely. I threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound echoed sharply across the silent backyard. The guests shifted uncomfortably, holding their breath. Sabrina's smug, confident smile faltered. My mother looked outraged, stepping forward as if to scold a misbehaving child. Are you having a mental breakdown, Fiona? My mother hissed, her face turning red. This is serious business. Oh, it is very serious, I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye and stepping forward to face them. But not for the reason you think. Sabrina, tell me again about this passionate secret affair you had with my husband. Did he happen to mention his medical history while you were together in bed? Sabrina blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. What does his medical history have to do with anything? She stammered, looking to my father for help. It has everything to do with it, I said, walking right up to the gift table. I picked up the forged will and held it up for the crowd of staring guests to see. Because Aaron had severe testicular cancer when he was 19 years old. It was incredibly aggressive and almost killed him. He had to undergo a bilateral orchiectomy. That means both of his testes were surgically removed to save his life. He wore prosthetics, Sabrina. He was 100% permanently sterile and biologically incapable of fathering a child through natural means. The color completely drained from Sabrina's face, leaving her looking pale and sick. The guests in the backyard began to whisper frantically among themselves, pointing and staring. The beautiful, tragic narrative of the secret romance had just hit a solid concrete wall of medical reality. My husband and I went through years of grief over not being able to conceive. Naturally, I continued, my voice rising with righteous anger, making sure every person in the yard could hear me. We knew from the very day we met that he could never get me pregnant, let alone you. So, unless this baby is the result of a medical miracle, you are a liar and this will is a pathetic amateur forgery. I threw the fake document back onto the table. I expected them to crumble to beg for forgiveness, or at least retreat into the house in shame. But I had drastically underestimated the depths of their depravity and their desperate need for money. My father did not look defeated. He looked prepared, like a man pulling out his final trump card. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. We know all about the cancer, Fiona. My father growled, stepping into my personal space and lowering his voice so only the people closest could hear the viciousness in his tone. Aaron did not sleep with Sabrina. He knew he could not, but he desperately wanted his genetics to live on, and he knew your body was not up to the task. My breath hitched at the sheer cruelty of his words, designed specifically to target my deepest insecurities. What are you talking about? I demanded, refusing to back down. Aaron froze his sperm before the surgeries when he was 19. my father said, projecting his voice again to regain the crowd's attention. He secretly paid for Sabrina to go to an offshore fertility clinic using his frozen samples. He wanted Sabrina to be the mother of his child because she is young, healthy, and full of life. He thrust the paper into my hands, shoving it against my chest. Here is the clinic receipt for $50,000. It is from Aaron's private offshore account. Look at the signature. I looked down at the paper. It was a wire transfer receipt from a clinic I had never heard of authorizing a massive $50,000 payment. At the bottom of the page was Aaron's signature. I stared closely at the ink. It was not a sloppy forgery or a digital copy. It was his exact distinct signature right down to the specific slant of the final letter. The world tilted sharply on its axis. My cybersecurity brain kicked into high gear, pushing the rising panic aside. I knew Aaron had not done this. I knew my husband better than I knew myself, and he despised my family's toxicity as much as I did. But the signature on the authorization form was terrifyingly real, and the $50,000 had clearly moved from an account bearing his credentials. I stared at the piece of paper, my mind racing a mile a minute, connecting the digital dots. This was not just a greedy golden child sister making up a desperate lie to steal my house. This was a massive, highly coordinated financial conspiracy, and my entire family was in on it to the very end. I left the birthday party without saying another word. I simply turned my back on my parents and my sister, leaving them standing by the gift table with their forged documents and their fake tragedy. Let them think they had won. Let them believe my silence was the silence of a defeated, broken widow. I walked to my car with my head held high, ignoring the whispers and stares of the wealthy party guests. I drove home in a state of cold, absolute focus. The crushing grief that had been suffocating me for 3 long weeks was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp clinical need to uncover the absolute truth. As soon as I walked through the front door of the house they were trying to steal from me, I went straight to my home office. I locked the door behind me and booted up my encrypted workstation. My parents had always mocked my career choices. My father, Gordon, constantly called my computer science degree unladylike and a complete waste of money. They had absolutely refused to pay a single cent toward my college tuition, telling me I should focus on finding a wealthy husband instead of staring at screens all day. Meanwhile, they happily poured tens of thousands of dollars into Sabrina's failed acting classes. They paid the exorbitant rent on her luxury downtown apartments and entirely subsidized her superficial life as a struggling social media influencer. Now, the very technical skills they had so deeply despised were going to be my ultimate weapon against them. I sat down at my primary monitor and pulled up the high-resolution digital copy I had snapped of the clinic receipt my father had shoved into my hands. I isolated the routing number, the account details, and the bank identifier codes. As a senior cybersecurity analyst for one of the largest financial institutions in the country, I have access to tools and tracing protocols that ordinary people do not even know exist. I bypassed standard banking firewalls, masking my IP address through a series of secure proxy servers. I needed to trace the exact digital footprint of that offshore account without triggering any alarms. It took me less than 3 hours of intense coding and cross-referencing to crack the shell company wide open. The routing number did not lead to a cutting-edge medical fertility facility in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It traced directly back to a corporate registration in the Cayman Islands. I dug much deeper, running the names of the listed board members through international law enforcement databases and financial watch lists. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The offshore company was a well-known money laundering front for a massive illegal high-stakes sports gambling syndicate. Sabrina did not use Aaron's money for in vitro fertilization. Sabrina was a degenerate gambler. I accessed Sabrina's public digital footprint and used it to map her recent online activity and financial transfers. The picture that quickly emerged on my screens was pathetic and utterly terrifying. My golden child sister had been hemorrhaging money for years, betting on everything from international soccer matches to underground boxing circuits. She had completely drained her own accounts and maxed out dozens of credit cards. According to the internal ledgers I managed to access, she owed the dangerous gambling syndicate a staggering $350,000. The $50,000 payment on that fake clinic receipt was just a drop in the bucket. It was merely a small installment to keep the bookies from breaking her legs, or worse. But that devastating discovery did not explain why my parents were so heavily involved. Why would my father proudly produce a forged receipt and stand shoulder to shoulder with Sabrina to steal my house? Why would my mother risk her perfect social standing to participate in such a massive fraud? I went back into the financial ledgers and traced the syndicate's incoming wire transfers over the past 12 months. I cross-referenced those specific offshore transfers with my parents' local financial records. What I found scrolling across my monitor made my blood run completely cold. There was a secondary wire transfer routing sequence linking the illegal gambling ring directly to my parents' home equity line of credit. Gordon and Beverly were not just enabling Sabrina out of blind parental love. They were legal co-signers on her massive illegal debt. They had mortgaged their own affluent suburban lifestyle, their retirement funds, and their pristine credit scores to keep their precious golden child out of physical danger. And now the syndicate was squeezing them just as hard. Their prestigious country club memberships, their luxury cars, their perfect public image, all of it was on the verge of total collapse. They were entirely broke. They were drowning in debt to a dangerous criminal enterprise, and they needed a massive influx of cash to survive. My custom-built $950,000 house was their golden ticket out of ruin. They knew Aaron was sterile, so they could not claim a natural affair. Instead, they went to unimaginable lengths. They forged a will and a clinic receipt, framing my dead husband to steal my assets and save their own skins from the mob. They were willing to destroy my life, tarnish the memory of the only man who ever truly loved me, and leave me destitute on the street just to cover up Sabrina's crippling gambling addiction. I sat back in my desk chair, staring at the glowing monitors in the dark room. The sheer scale of their betrayal was breathtaking. For 34 years, I had internalized their constant criticism. I had let them make me feel like I was never smart enough, pretty enough, or worthy enough of their affection. I had quietly accepted my role as the unloved scapegoat, while they paraded Sabrina around as the perfect, flawless daughter. But this was no longer just toxic family dynamics or cruel parental favoritism. This was a calculated, predatory financial crime. I spent the rest of the night printing out the digital ledgers, the offshore account tracing documents, the wire transfer confirmations, and the corporate registration files, proving the fertility clinic was actually a gambling front. I highlighted the exact dates and amounts that linked my parents' home equity line of credit directly to the criminal syndicate. I organized every single piece of undeniable evidence into a thick black leather folder. I was building an impenetrable paper trail of their crimes, and I was going to use it to burn their entire world to the ground. Just as the sun began to rise over my backyard, casting a pale morning light through my office blinds, my phone buzzed loudly on the desk. It was a text message from my mother, Beverly. The tone was exactly as condescending, arrogant, and impatient as I expected. "Come to the country club for Sunday brunch at noon. We need to discuss your move-out date and how to handle the deed transfer quietly without any more of your embarrassing public outbursts. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Fiona." I read the message twice, letting the sheer audacity of her words sink in. They really thought I was going to surrender. They thought I was the same quiet, obedient girl who used to shrink away when they raised their voices. They truly believed that my paralyzing grief over Aaron would make me an easy, compliant target who would just hand over $1 million estate to keep the peace. They thought I would quietly pack my bags and disappear into the shadows so they could pay off their criminal debts with my husband's hard-earned legacy. I looked at the thick black folder resting heavily on my desk. I thought about Aaron. I thought about the beautiful, peaceful life we had built together in this house and the future they were brutally trying to steal from me. I did not reply to my mother's text message. Instead, I walked out of my office and into my master bedroom. I opened my closet and reached past the dark conservative morning clothes I had worn for the past 3 weeks. I pulled out a sharp, perfectly tailored dress and a pair of tall black heels. I washed my face, applied my makeup with careful precision, and brushed my hair until it shone. I grabbed my car keys and picked up the heavy folder of evidence. I was not going to the country club to surrender my home. I was going to war. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club took exactly 22 minutes, but my mind was racing so fast, it felt like a single chaotic second. I gripped the steering wheel of my car until my knuckles turned white. Beside me on the passenger seat sat the thick black folder containing every piece of digital evidence I had spent the entire night compiling. My parents thought they could summon me to a civilized Sunday brunch to discuss the surrender of my home. They thought I would show up with my head bowed and my spirit broken by grief, ready to sign over the only sanctuary I had left. They were wrong. I pulled through the massive wrought iron gates of the club and handed my keys to the young valet without saying a single word. The air inside the main clubhouse smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted espresso. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black bow ties glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of champagne and imported caviar. It was a world of superficial perfection, a place where wealthy people came to hide their ugly secrets behind polite smiles and designer clothing. I walked straight through the grand lobby, my tall black heels clicking sharply against the stone. I did not stop at the host stand. I knew exactly where my parents would be sitting. They always requested the exact same table on the outdoor terrace, overlooking the pristine green grass of the 18th hole. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the warm Sunday sunlight. I spotted them immediately. My mother Beverly was wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a flawless white linen dress, looking like the absolute picture of suburban grace. My father Gordon sat across from her in his tailored navy blazer, laughing heartily at a joke being told by the club president at a neighboring table. They looked so relaxed, so completely unbothered by the fact that they had just attempted to defraud their grieving daughter and frame their dead son-in-law. The sheer sociopathic ease of their behavior sent a fresh wave of cold fury rushing through my veins. I marched straight up to their table. My mother saw me first, and her polite social smile vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a tight, annoyed grimace as her eyes swept over my dark, tailored dress. "Fiona, what are you doing wearing that?" she hissed, keeping her voice low and glancing around nervously to see if anyone was paying attention to us. "We told you to come quietly and handle this like an adult. You look like you are going to a funeral." I said, my voice perfectly level. "I am attending the funeral of your reputation." I did not give them a chance to respond. I raised the heavy black leather folder and slammed it down dead center on their glass patio table. The loud smack made their crystal glasses rattle and splashed bright orange mimosa over my father's pristine white cloth napkin. "What is the meaning of this?" Gordon demanded, his face instantly flushing red with anger. "People are looking at us. Sit down and lower your voice immediately." "I am not sitting down and I am not lowering my voice," I said, leaning forward, resting my hands on the table. I opened the folder to the very first page. It was an enlarged, brightly highlighted digital printout of the offshore bank, tracing I had completed hours earlier. I found the Cayman Islands Shell Company, Gordon. I know exactly what it is. I know it is a digital front for an illegal high-stakes sports gambling syndicate. I know Sabrina did not use Aaron's money for fertility treatments. I know she owes dangerous people $350,000. And I know that the $50,000 receipt you shoved in my chest yesterday was just a small, desperate installment to keep the bookies from breaking your golden child's legs. The blood completely drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking gray and sick beneath the brim of her expensive hat. My father's jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. I flipped to the next page in the folder. But that is not even the best part, I continued, making sure my words sliced through the air like a knife. I traced the incoming wire transfers. I found the secondary routing sequences. I know that the two of you are legal co-signers on Sabrina's massive illegal debt. I know you tied your own home equity line of credit directly to a criminal enterprise. You are entirely broke, Lee. You are drowning in mob debt, and you decided to frame my dead husband and steal my $950,000 house to save your own skins. I stood up straight, crossing my arms and looking down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I waited for the apologies. I waited for the shame, the tears, or the desperate begging. I thought that confronted with absolute undeniable proof of their crimes they would finally break. Instead, my mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. "You should not go digging into things you do not understand, Fiona," my mother whispered, her voice dripping with vicious venom. Sabrina made a few bad bets. She got in over her head with some very difficult people. If she does not pay them back in full by the end of the month, she is going to federal prison, or she is going to wind up dead. You have to give her the house. It is the only asset we can liquidate fast enough to cover the remaining balance. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer staggering entitlement of her demand. "You want me to render myself homeless to pay off my sister's gambling debts?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. "You are a barren widow," Beverly hissed, leaning closer across the table. "You live alone in a massive 4-bedroom house that you do not even need. Aaron is dead. You cannot have children. What do you possibly need all that space for? Sabrina has a baby. She has a whole life ahead of her. You are just being selfish, holding on to a property you cannot even fill." I felt the breath knock out of my lungs. The cruelty was so absolute, so precise, and targeted at my deepest trauma that it momentarily paralyzed me. My own mother was weaponizing my infertility and my husband's sudden death to justify stealing my home. But the shock only lasted a second, before the righteous protective anger flooded back in, burning away the pain. I reached down, closed the black folder, and picked it back up tightly against my side. "You are right about one thing. I am a widow," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly icy calm. "And that house belongs to me and the man I loved. I am leaving now. I am taking this folder directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. I am turning over the offshore wire transfers, the proof of the forged will, the fake medical receipts, and the evidence of your extortion. You and Sabrina are going to federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. Enjoy your brunch." I turned on my heel, my black pumps clicking sharply against the terrace stones as I walked away. I felt a massive surge of absolute victory. For 34 years, I had let these people walk all over me. I had let them treat me like a disposable, unwanted burden. But today, I had finally won. I had finally broken free of their toxic control, and I was going to watch them face the consequences of their own actions. I was exactly 3 steps away from the table when my father's voice cut through the warm morning air. "Go ahead and call the federal agents, Fiona," he said. His voice was not panicked. It was not angry or pleading. It was terrifyingly calm and steady. I froze in my tracks and slowly turned back around to look at him. Gordon was casually reaching into his leather briefcase, which was sitting on the empty wrought iron chair beside him. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it across the glass table toward the edge. He tapped the top of it with his index finger, looking at me with a cold, calculating smirk. "Call them," he repeated, "but you will be arresting yourself." I walked back to the table and picked up the envelope, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of dense legal paperwork. It was a copy of a commercial loan agreement dated exactly 3 years ago. It was a secondary financing contract tied directly to the gambling syndicate's shadow lenders for a staggering $500,000. I rapidly scanned the document, my trained eyes flying over the financial jargon until I landed on the final signature page. Right there on the bottom line, acting as the primary legal guarantor for Sabrina's entire massive gambling debt, was my signature. It was perfectly executed, matching my handwriting flawlessly. "I never signed this," I breathed, feeling the sunlit patio begin to spin wildly beneath my feet. "I know," my father smiled, leaning back in his chair and taking a slow sip of his mimosa. "I forged it. I am very good with signatures, Fiona. I have been practicing yours since you were in high school. But the syndicate does not care who actually put the pen to the paper. They only care whose financial assets are legally tied to the contract. If you go to the authorities, they will freeze all of our accounts, and the syndicate will instantly call in the debt. I will trigger the default tomorrow morning. The shadow lenders will seize your house legally through the courts, and they will destroy your life anyway." My father set his glass down and locked eyes with me. If you expose us, Fiona, you go down right alongside us. You have until tomorrow night to sign the deed over to Sabrina. Do not make us ruin your life. I drove away from the Oak Ridge Country Club, feeling as though the ground had been ripped out from under me. The heavy manila envelope sat on my passenger seat, mocking me. My own father had forged my signature to guarantee a $500,000 loan to a criminal syndicate. He had weaponized my identity, binding my financial future to Sabrina's gambling addiction. I was trapped. If I went to the police, he would default on the loan, and the shadow lenders would seize my home and my assets. I needed time to think, to formulate a countermeasure that would dismantle his trap without triggering the destruction of my own life. But my family had no intention of giving me time. I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street and immediately slammed on the brakes. A rusted pickup truck was parked illegally across my driveway, tearing up the manicured grass. The tailgate was down, loaded with cheap pink suitcases and cardboard boxes. I jumped out of my car and ran toward my front porch. Through the side gate, I heard the distinct sound of shattering glass. I sprinted into the backyard and stopped dead in my tracks. Sabrina was standing on my patio, holding a crowbar. Beside her was a tall, scruffy man with a fading neck tattoo and an aggressive smirk. It took me a second to recognize him from old social media posts. It was Trevor, Mason's biological father. The deadbeat who had allegedly abandoned Sabrina a year ago was now standing on my property, helping her break into my house. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping forward. "Get away from my house before I call the police." Sabrina did not even flinch. She dropped the crowbar onto the patio stones with a loud clang and crossed her arms. "We are not breaking in, Fiona. We are moving in. We have every right to be here." Trevor stepped forward, trying to use his size to intimidate me. "This is my son's house now, lady. You better back off and hand over the keys before things get ugly." I did not back off. I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services, immediately reporting a break-in in progress. 10 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up to my house with their lights flashing. I met the officers in the driveway, pointing toward the backyard. I demanded they arrest my sister and her violent boyfriend for trespassing and property damage. The older officer approached Sabrina, asking for her identification. Instead of acting scared, my sister reached into her designer purse and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She handed them to the officer with a practiced, tearful expression, playing the role of the victimized single mother perfectly. "These are the court documents," she told the officer, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "My brother-in-law passed away and left half of this estate to my son. I also have an emergency injunction from family court granting me immediate access to the premises to ensure the property is not sold or damaged during the probate process. Plus, my sister is the primary financial guarantor on all of my accounts, so we are legally tied entities. I have squatters' rights." I watched in absolute horror as the police officer reviewed the forged will, the fake clinic receipts, the fraudulent guarantor contract my father had just shown me, and the emergency injunction signed by my father's corrupt judge friend. The officer handed the papers back to Sabrina and turned to look at me with a tired, sympathetic sigh. "I am sorry, ma'am," the officer said, putting his notepad away. "She has a court-ordered injunction and paperwork establishing legal residency claims. This is a civil matter. We cannot forcibly remove her from the premises without a direct order from an eviction judge. You will have to take this up in family court on Monday." "You have got to be kidding me," I argued, my voice rising with panic. "Those documents are entirely forged. They are breaking into my home." "There is nothing we can do today," the second officer added. "If things get violent, call us back. Otherwise, let the lawyers sort it out." The police walked back to their cruisers and drove away, leaving me standing completely defenseless in my own backyard. Sabrina turned to me, her face twisting into a triumphant, wicked grin. She pushed past me, unlocking the back door from the inside through the broken window pane. Trevor grabbed 2 heavy suitcases from the truck and shouldered his way into my kitchen, tracking mud across my clean hardwood floors. "We will be taking Aaron's old office," Sabrina announced, tossing her purse onto my kitchen island. "It gets the best morning light. You have until tomorrow night to sign the deed over completely, or Dad defaults on the loan and the mob takes everything. Try to make us comfortable until then, sis." They marched down the hallway, moving their garbage into the sanctuary my husband and I had built together. I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking with a mixture of profound violation and white-hot rage. They had invaded my safe space. They were desecrating Aaron's memory by letting that criminal sleep in his office. But Sabrina had made one massive critical miscalculation. She had forgotten exactly what I do for a living. She had forgotten that this house was not just a building made of wood and glass. It was a cutting-edge smart home, and I was the supreme administrator of its entire digital infrastructure. I did not scream or argue. I quietly walked upstairs to the master suite and stepped inside, locking the heavy, solid oak door behind me. I went straight to my home office, which adjoined the master bedroom, and booted up my primary command console. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, bypassing the standard user interface, and diving deep into the administrative root access of my home network. First things first. I executed a heavy security protocol, locking down the smart locks on my bedroom and office doors. I disabled the manual overrides, meaning neither Sabrina nor Trevor could force their way into my wing of the house without using C4 explosives. Next, I accessed the central HVAC control systems. I isolated the climate zones in the house. I kept the master suite at a comfortable 70 degrees, but I remotely dropped the thermostat in the guest wing and Aaron's office to a freezing 50 degrees. I then locked the digital thermostats so they could not be adjusted manually from the walls. Then I moved to the water utility controls. I accessed the smart valve system and completely shut off the hot water supply to the guest bathrooms. If Trevor and Sabrina wanted to shower, they were going to do it in ice water. Finally, I targeted their digital lifeline. I logged into my commercial-grade router. I identified Sabrina and Trevor's cell phones and tablets, trying to connect to my network. I did not just block them. I actively throttled their cellular data signals, using a signal jammer app I had installed for security testing, creating a dead zone exclusively in their wing of the house. I cut off their access to the outside world, plunging my sister and her deadbeat boyfriend into a freezing, disconnected nightmare. Let them try to enjoy their squatter's rights while shivering in the dark without a Wi-Fi connection. With the house secured against the invaders, I sat back in my chair and pulled out the manila envelope my father had given me at the country club. I needed to find a flaw in the forged guarantor contract. I needed to figure out how Gordon had managed to make my digital signature look so flawlessly authentic to the shadow lenders. I spread the legal documents out across my desk and turned on my high-intensity desk lamp. I ignored the legal jargon and the terrifying financial threats, focusing entirely on the digital certification stamp at the bottom of the final page. Modern commercial loan agreements are not just signed with ink. They are authenticated through secure digital portals that log the exact time, date, and location of the signature to prevent fraud. I typed the digital certification code from the paperwork into an independent tracking database. I needed to see the exact metadata attached to the moment my father forged my consent. The raw data populated on my screen, filling the black monitor with lines of green text. I scanned past the timestamps and the encrypted keys until my eyes landed on the origination IP address. This was the unique digital fingerprint of the computer network that was used to submit the fraudulent loan application 3 years ago. I ran a quick trace on the IP address, expecting it to ping back to my parents' suburban home router or perhaps Gordon's failing real estate firm. The trace completed in less than 2 seconds. The result flashed on my screen, and all the air completely vanished from my lungs. The IP address did not belong to my parents. It did not belong to a public library or a coffee shop or a proxy server in the Cayman Islands. The IP address belonged to Aaron's old corporate tech firm. I stared at the glowing numbers, my mind refusing to process the information. The fraudulent loan that tied my life to a criminal syndicate was authorized and digitally signed using my husband's private corporate network. It was executed during business hours on a secure server that only Aaron had administrative access to. A cold, terrifying sense of dread washed over my entire body. My father had claimed he forged my signature, but Gordon barely knew how to operate a smartphone, let alone bypass enterprise-level corporate firewalls to execute a $500,000 shadow loan. Aaron was a brilliant tech executive. Aaron had the access. Aaron had the skills. I looked over at the framed photograph of my smiling husband sitting on my desk. The man I had grieved for 3 agonizing weeks. The man I thought was my protector. Was Aaron involved in this massive conspiracy from the very beginning? Did my husband knowingly sell my financial future to a gambling syndicate to protect my sister? Or was his identity brutally stolen by my family before he died? I needed answers, and I knew exactly where I had to go to find them. I grabbed my car keys, feeling the walls of my own safe haven closing in on me. I drove away from my house with my mind spinning through 1,000 different terrifying scenarios. The revelation that the fraudulent loan had been authorized from Aaron's corporate IP address was a poison spreading through my veins. I needed a professional perspective. I needed someone entirely outside the jurisdiction of my father's corrupt local connections. I drove straight downtown to the federal building to meet with Agent Bradley. He was a senior investigator for the Financial Crimes Division, whom I had collaborated with on several massive banking breaches over the years. I sat in his sterile, windowless office and laid out the entire timeline. I showed him the offshore routing numbers, the syndicate ties, the forged guarantor contract, and finally the IP address trace. Bradley reviewed the data with a grim expression. He explained that while the IP address belonged to Aaron's company, the digital authorization required physical access to Aaron's secondary authentication tokens. Someone had to have his physical devices to push that loan through. Bradley looked me dead in the eye and asked the question I was terrified to answer. Was your husband in on this, or was he a victim of proximity? I told Bradley I was going to find out. Bradley warned me that the syndicate my family was dealing with did not leave loose ends. He told me to secure any physical hardware Aaron had kept at the house before my family realized what I was doing. I raced back to my neighborhood, breaking every speed limit on the highway. As I pulled into my driveway, my stomach plummeted. The heavy security lockdown I had initiated on my smart home network was still active, but physical barriers can only do so much against desperate people. I ran up the front steps and unlocked the main door. The house was dead quiet. I moved swiftly up the stairs to the master suite. The solid oak door leading to my private wing had been brutally splintered. The frame was shattered, the heavy deadbolt ripped completely out of the wood. Trevor had clearly used his brute strength to smash through the physical barricade I had set up. I stepped through this ruined doorway and walked toward Aaron's home office. The thick glass door to his sanctuary had been smashed to pieces. Shards of frosted glass littered the hardwood floor, crunching under my heels as I walked inside. Sabrina was standing in the middle of the room. She was frantically tearing through Aaron's filing cabinets, hurling tax documents and personal files over her shoulder. The room we had decorated together, the place where Aaron used to sit and read to me while I coded, was completely trashed. Drawers were pulled out and flipped upside down. Books were ripped from the shelves and thrown against the walls. "What do you think you are doing?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the destroyed room. Sabrina spun around, gripping a heavy steel crowbar in her right hand. She did not look guilty or caught. She looked absolutely feral. Her eyes were wide and her hair was a mess. She was a cornered animal, realizing the walls were closing in on her fake narrative. "I am taking back what belongs to me," she sneered, kicking a pile of scattered folders out of her way. "You think you are so smart, Fiona, locking us in the freezing cold? But you cannot lock me out of my own son's inheritance." I stepped further into the room, refusing to let her intimidate me with the weapon. "There is no inheritance, Sabrina. I know about the gambling debts. I know about the Cayman Islands Shell Company. I know Mom and Dad are co-signers on your illegal loans. It is over." Sabrina let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "You really think you have it all figured out, do you not? You think Aaron was this perfect, loyal husband who loved his boring, barren wife." She took a step closer, pointing the tip of the crowbar at my chest. "Aaron always pitied you, Fiona. He told me himself. He was suffocating in this silent, empty house with a woman who cared more about firewalls than giving him a real family." My breath hitched, but I kept my face entirely blank. She fed on emotion, and I refused to give her a single drop of satisfaction. "He loved my vibrant energy." Sabrina continued pacing around the ruined office. "He wanted to feel alive. That is why he secretly helped us. He knew about my debts long before he died. He used his corporate access to push that loan through because he wanted to take care of me. He was planning to leave you, Fiona. He was going to leave you and take care of his real family. That is why he left me the house. He wanted to make sure you were left with absolutely nothing, just like you deserve. The sheer venom in her words was designed to break my spirit, to make me doubt the last 8 years of my life. She wanted me to believe that my husband, the man I had buried just 3 weeks ago, was a monster who had plotted my financial ruin. But Sabrina made a fatal error. She assumed my husband was as weak and treacherous as she was. I watched her eyes dart toward the large, expensive dual-monitor desktop setup sitting on Aaron's mahogany desk. It was his primary workstation, a high-end rig with glowing LED lights and a massive glass casing. "You think you can use his digital files to prove your little theories?" Sabrina hissed, raising the crowbar high above her head. "You think you can lock me up?" With a vicious scream, she brought the heavy steel bar crashing down onto the primary monitor. The screen shattered, instantly exploding into a shower of black plastic and sparking wires. She swung again and again, bringing the weapon down onto the expensive glass casing of the computer tower. She smashed the motherboard, she destroyed the hard drives, she pulverized the graphics cards. She beat the machine until it was nothing but a pile of twisted, smoking metal on the desk. She stood there panting, her chest heaving as she looked at the wreckage. There she smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Go ahead and try to trace your little IP addresses now. Everything he knew, everything he saved, is gone. You have no proof." I stood perfectly still, watching her gloat over the destroyed computer. I let my shoulders slump slightly. I let a look of absolute defeat wash over my face. I let my eyes well up with tears that were entirely fabricated. "What have you done?" I whispered, making my voice tremble with fake devastation. "That was everything." Sabrina let out a triumphant, victorious laugh. She dropped the crowbar onto the floor right at my feet. "I told you, Fiona. You should have just signed the house over. Now you have no husband, no evidence, and no future. Start packing your bags." She pushed past me, her shoulder slamming into mine as she strutted out of the ruined office, kicking the shattered glass out of her way. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway. I waited until I heard the heavy thud of the guest wing door closing in the distance, indicating she had gone back to Trevor. Then I dropped the fake tears. My face went completely stone cold. I walked over to the ruined desk and kicked the useless, destroyed computer parts out of my way. Sabrina was a superficial fool. She thought flashing lights in a big glass case meant important data. She thought Aaron, a man who managed enterprise security for a living, would keep his most sensitive personal files on a visible, unsecured desktop machine. Aaron and I were cut from the same cloth. We did not trust conventional storage. I walked away from the desk and moved over to the built-in mahogany bookshelves lining the back wall. Sitting on the third shelf, surrounded by old hardcover books, was a vintage 1960s wooden radio. It was a beautiful antique piece with brass dials and a woven fabric speaker grill. Aaron had bought it at a flea market years ago. At least that is what we told people when they visited. I reached behind the heavy wooden radio and pressed a hidden biometric thumbprint scanner flush against the back panel. A tiny green LED light blinked twice. There was a soft mechanical click. I grabbed the sides of the vintage radio and pulled. The entire wooden casing slid forward, revealing what was actually hidden inside. It was not a radio. It was a custom-built liquid-cooled solid-state encrypted server. It was entirely offline, disconnected from any external networks, running on its own dedicated power supply. I carefully extracted the heavy metal block and carried it into my own secure office, plugging it directly into my clean, isolated workstation. The screen prompted me for a dual authentication passphrase. I typed in the sequence Aaron and I had established for absolute emergencies. The decryption software hummed to life, stripping away the military-grade protection layers Aaron had coded himself. The internal drive loaded onto my monitor. I opened the primary directory labeled simply with my name. I held my breath, terrified of what I might find, terrified that Sabrina's cruel taunts might hold some shred of truth. I clicked on the first folder and the data populated instantly. I did not find love letters to my sister. I did not find proof that my husband had betrayed me to a gambling syndicate. I found exactly why Sabrina was desperately trying to destroy his office. I found exactly what Aaron had been doing in the final days before his sudden death, and it changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about the timeline of this massive conspiracy. I sat in the glow of my secure workstation watching the decryption software strip away the final layers of military-grade protection. The internal drive loaded onto my monitor, and I opened the primary directory labeled simply with my name. I held my breath, terrified of what I might find, terrified that Sabrina's cruel taunts might hold some shred of truth. I clicked on the first folder, and the data populated instantly. I did not find love letters to my sister. I did not find proof that my husband had betrayed me to a gambling syndicate. I found exactly why Sabrina was desperately trying to destroy his office. I found exactly what Aaron had been doing in the final days before his sudden death, and it changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about the timeline of this massive conspiracy. Aaron was meticulous. He was a brilliant enterprise security executive, and he approached everything in his life with absolute precision. The folder was labeled Identity Theft Investigation. I opened it, and tears of absolute profound relief began streaming down my face. The heavy, suffocating weight that Sabrina had placed on my chest just 10 minutes ago completely vanished. Aaron had never loved her. He had never pitied me or wanted to leave me for her vibrant energy. He was actively investigating my father, Gordon, and my sister, Sabrina. He was acting as my silent, fierce protector, operating in the shadows to secure my future. According to his private case notes, Aaron had noticed a tiny anomaly in our joint credit monitoring system just 1 week before his sudden fatal aneurysm. Being the expert that he was, he did not just ignore the alert or write it off as a bank error. He dug deep into the origin of the ping. He had uncovered the massive $500,000 shadow loan. He found the forged guarantor contract bearing my meticulously copied signature. He traced the origination IP address and discovered exactly how Gordon had managed to spoof my consent. My father had used a remote access Trojan hidden in an email attachment to hijack our home network and route the fraudulent signature through Aaron's corporate server to make it look legitimate. Aaron knew everything. He knew about the offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. He knew about Sabrina's degenerate sports gambling addiction. He knew that my own parents had sold my financial future to a violent criminal syndicate to protect their golden child. He had spent his final days piecing together their entire criminal network, tracking every single dollar they had laundered through their country club accounts and their home equity line of credit. I opened the next directory labeled The Arsenal. Aaron had not just collected screenshots and bank statements. He had compiled a massive, undeniably bulletproof digital dossier. He had drafted a comprehensive civil lawsuit and a formal criminal complaint addressed directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had named Gordon and Sabrina as the primary targets for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and extortion. He had cross-referenced every single illegal transaction, mapping out a prosecution strategy that no defense attorney could ever dismantle. Reading through his legal drafts, I could feel his profound, unwavering love for me in every single keystroke. He was not planning to give my family a second chance. He was not going to sit them down for a polite intervention to protect family harmony. He was preparing to hand my father and my sister over to federal authorities and send them to prison to shield me from the syndicate. He was going to burn their entire toxic lives to the ground to keep me safe. But then tragedy struck. I pulled up the system properties and looked at the last modified timestamps on Aaron's files. The digital fingerprints told a story so dark it made my blood run cold. He had finalized the FBI dossier on a Tuesday night. His brain aneurysm had ruptured just 3 days later on a Friday morning. I sat back in my chair as a sickening, horrifying realization washed over me. The timeline shifted dramatically in my mind, exposing the absolute darkest depths of my family's depravity. The fake will demanding half of my $950,000 house. The $50,000 offshore fertility clinic receipt. All of those documents had been forged completely post-mortem. Gordon and Sabrina knew Aaron was investigating them. They knew he was putting the pieces together and was about to blow the whistle, exposing their massive financial crimes. When Aaron suddenly tragically died, they did not mourn him. They did not shed a single real tear for the man who had been a part of our family for 8 years. They saw his death as a miraculous, convenient loophole. They realized my fiercely protective husband was permanently out of the picture. They rushed their plot the very moment he took his last breath. They desperately scrambled to forge the will and the clinic receipt framing a dead man to cover up their tracks. They banked entirely on my paralyzing, crushing grief to blind me to the details. They thought a grieving, broken widow would be too hysterical and exhausted to check the metadata or verify the medical impossibilities of a secret pregnancy. They used my husband's corpse as a shield to save themselves from the mob. They actively weaponized my tragedy to steal my home and pay off their illegal debts. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, feeling a new kind of energy surging through my veins. It was no longer just anger. It was a cold, calculated need for absolute destruction. My sister was currently sitting downstairs in the freezing cold, completely unaware that the very computer she had just destroyed was nothing more than a decoy. She had no idea that the real evidence was currently in my hands, painting a vivid, undeniable picture of her imminent ruin. I continued scrolling through the bottom of the directory, determined to review every single piece of data Aaron had left me. Buried inside a restricted subfolder, I noticed an audio file labeled Final Warning. I plugged in my secure, encrypted headphones and clicked play. Hearing Aaron's voice again after 3 weeks of deafening silence made my heart ache with a violent intensity. I closed my eyes, just listening to the familiar sound of his breathing. But the tone of his voice was not warm or comforting. It was pure, unyielding steel. It was a recorded voicemail he had left directly on Gordon's personal cell phone exactly 3 days before his death. "I know what you did to Fiona's credit." Aaron's voice echoed through my headphones, sharp and deadly calm. "You have 72 hours to confess to the authorities, or I will hand this drive to the feds myself." The recording ended with a sharp click. I took off my headphones and stared at the silent monitor. My parents knew. They knew Aaron was going to destroy their entire criminal enterprise. They had lived for 3 days in absolute terror, waiting for the federal agents to kick down their country club doors and drag them away in handcuffs. And when Aaron died, they thought they had gotten away with it. They probably celebrated his aneurysm as a stroke of divine intervention. They thought the threat was buried with him 6 feet under the ground. They believed they could seamlessly transition from being Aaron's targets to becoming my predators, taking everything I had left. They did not know that Aaron had left the executioner's axe right here waiting for me to pick it up. I unplugged the custom liquid-cooled server from my secure workstation and carefully placed it inside a heavy shock-proof transit case. I did not shed another tear. The time for mourning was over. I grabbed my keys and walked straight out of my house, leaving Sabrina to shiver in the freezing dark of the guest wing. I drove directly back downtown to the federal building. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints, flashing my contractor credentials to the armed guards in the lobby. I walked straight back to the Financial Crimes Division. Agent Bradley was exactly where I had left him, sitting behind his cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of corporate fraud files. I set the heavy transit case down in front of him and opened the latches. I told him my husband was not a traitor. He was an investigator, and he had already done half of the Bureau's job for them. Bradley watched in stunned silence as I booted up the drive and walked him through the massive digital dossier Aaron had compiled. He saw the drafted federal complaint, the mapped-out money laundering routes, and the direct links tying my parents' home equity line to the violent sports gambling syndicate. But Bradley was a seasoned federal agent, and he immediately pointed out the missing link. He said this proved Aaron knew about the fraud, but we still needed to definitively prove who actually forged the final documents. We needed to link the fake will and the offshore fertility clinic receipt directly to my father, beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt. I told Bradley to pull up his forensic tracing software. We were going to run a full metadata extraction on the forged files Sabrina had tried to use against me to steal my home. Bradley linked his secure terminal to the server, and initiated a deep packet inspection on the digital signature attached to the fake offshore clinic receipt. We watched the green text cascade down the federal monitor, peeling back the layers of digital encryption. The software isolated the exact timestamp of the signature. I stared at the numbers on the screen, and a wave of pure physical nausea washed over me. The time stamped on the document was 10:14 in the morning on a Friday. It was the exact same Friday that Aaron had suffered his fatal brain aneurysm. I pulled out my own phone and cross-referenced the timeline with my text message history. Aaron had collapsed in our kitchen at 8 in the morning. The ambulance had rushed him to the emergency room by 8:30. He was admitted to the intensive care unit completely unconscious and on life support by 9:15. I looked at Bradley, my hands shaking with a terrifying realization. The digital signature was authenticated using Aaron's stolen mobile credentials at 10:14. My husband was in a coma at 10:14. I closed my eyes, and the memories of that horrific morning played back in my mind with brutal, agonizing clarity. I remembered standing in the sterile white hallway of the intensive care unit, clutching a crumpled tissue and sobbing uncontrollably while the neurosurgeon explained that my husband was effectively brain dead. I remembered the harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of the life support machines keeping his heart beating. I remembered calling my parents in a state of absolute blind panic, begging them to come to the hospital. Gordon and Beverly had arrived shortly after 9:30. I remembered my father putting his arm around my shoulders and telling me to go to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee and collect myself. He told me he would sit in the room with Aaron so my husband would not be alone. I left my father alone in that hospital room for exactly 45 minutes. That was the window. While I was pacing the cafeteria floor, crying so hard I could barely breathe, my father was standing over my dying husband's unconscious body. Gordon had reached into Aaron's hospital gown and stolen his personal smartphone. He had grabbed Aaron's hand while the life was literally draining out of him and physically pressed my husband's thumb against the biometric scanner to unlock the device. He used his dying son-in-law's fingerprint to bypass the security protocols, authorize the offshore wire transfer, and digitally sign the forged will. Gordon and Sabrina had literally robbed a man on his deathbed while his wife wept just outside the door. The level of sociopathic detachment required to look your weeping daughter in the eye while robbing her dying husband was beyond my comprehension. The sheer sickening depravity of the act left Agent Bradley completely speechless. He leaned back in his office chair, running a hand over his face. He had investigated hardened cartel bosses and ruthless mob enforcers, but even he was visibly disgusted by the predatory cruelty of my own family. He told me this was no longer just a simple wire fraud case. This was aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and federal extortion. We had enough evidence to put them away for decades, but Bradley warned me that arresting them right now might not be enough to dismantle the entire gambling syndicate and protect my assets. Gordon was a slippery, well-connected real estate developer. If we just picked him up at his house, he would hire expensive lawyers, claim he was framed, and drag the legal battle out for years, while the shadow lenders quietly seized my house. We needed to catch him in the act of soliciting fraudulent funds. We needed a public, undeniable stage where he could not hide behind expensive attorneys or corrupt local judges. I looked up at the calendar hanging on Bradley's office wall, and a cold, calculating smile spread across my face. I knew exactly where we were going to drop the hammer. Every single year on the second Saturday of November, my parents hosted the Family Legacy Charity Gala at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a massive, glittering high society event, masquerading as a philanthropic endeavor. In reality, it was an elaborate networking scheme. Gordon used the gala to solicit millions of dollars from wealthy elite investors under the guise of funding his real estate expansion firm. He would stand on a brightly lit stage in a custom tuxedo, giving grand speeches about family values, trust, and community development. He used my mother's pristine social standing and Sabrina's fake influencer charm to convince local politicians, bank executives, and private equity managers to pour money into his company. It was the absolute pinnacle of their social calendar. It was the exact mechanism they used to fund their lavish lifestyle and cover up their massive financial failures. Tomorrow night was the annual gala. I thought about how Beverly would spend all day getting her hair and makeup done for the event. She would wear an expensive gown paid for by stolen money and smile for the photographers. Sabrina would be there too, playing the role of the tragic single mother looking for sympathy donations. They were planning to stand in a ballroom full of millionaires and ask for money to pay off the very gambling syndicate that was currently threatening my life. I looked at Agent Bradley and told him we were not going to arrest my father in the quiet privacy of his suburban home. We were going to rip off his mask in front of every single investor, politician, and socialite in the city. We were going to destroy his criminal enterprise and his social standing in one single devastating blow. Bradley agreed. He said he would spend the night preparing the federal warrants and mobilizing a tactical financial crimes unit. He told me to go home and play the part of the defeated broken widow for just one more day. I needed to convince them that their trap had worked, so they would walk onto that stage tomorrow night, feeling absolutely invincible. I thanked Bradley and walked out of the federal building with the encrypted server safely secured in my bag. I sat in my car in the parking garage, taking a deep, steadying breath. I was no longer the unloved scapegoat. I was the architect of their ruin. As I put my keys in the ignition, my cell phone buzzed loudly in the cup holder. The screen lit up with a text message from Gordon. The timing was almost poetic. I opened the message and read the brutal, arrogant words my father had typed. Sign the house deed over by tomorrow night or we activate the debt default. Do not make us ruin your life. You have 24 hours, Fiona. He thought he had me completely cornered. He thought his forged signature and his mob connections had reduced me to a helpless, terrified pawn. He had no idea that I had just spent the last 2 hours analyzing the exact digital fingerprint of his horrific hospital room theft. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute power. I typed my response with steady, deliberate fingers. I will bring the paperwork to the gala. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile as I pulled out of the parking garage and drove into the city lights. Tomorrow night I was going to wear black. But I was not going to be mourning my husband. I was going to be mourning them. I thought my parents and sister had won when they shoved a forged will in my face, claiming my late husband left my $950,000 house to his secret love child. They thought I was just a broken widow who would quietly hand over the deed to pay off their illegal offshore gambling debts. They did not know I had already cracked my husband's encrypted server, found his drafted federal lawsuit against them, and handed the digital fingerprints of their identity theft straight to a federal agent. Now they were expecting me to show up at their elite charity gala to surrender my home. Instead, I was about to lock the ballroom doors, hack their presentation screens, and send them all to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy a toxic family to protect your peace. My name is Fiona and I am 34 years old. I had just sent a text message to my father Gordon telling him I would bring the property deed to his charity gala tomorrow night. I pulled my car into my driveway and stared at my beautiful house. It was the sanctuary my husband Aaron and I had built together. Now it was currently occupied by my sister Sabrina and her deadbeat boyfriend Trevor, who were claiming squatter rights based on forged documents. I pulled out my phone and accessed the central administrative application for my smart home system. With a few slow, deliberate taps, I restored the hot water, the high-speed wireless internet, and the central heating to the guest wing of the house. I walked through the front door and waited in the kitchen. A few minutes later, Sabrina emerged from the hallway. She was wearing 2 heavy sweaters and holding a cup of steaming water, looking absolutely miserable, but incredibly smug. She smiled when she saw me standing by the kitchen island. "I knew you would figure out you were beaten," Sabrina said, taking a sip of her hot water. "Trevor was just about to smash the thermostat with his crowbar, but it looks like you finally found your common sense." I looked at my sister and forced my face to soften into a mask of pure defeated exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump forward and I stared at the floor. I played the part of the broken, grieving widow to absolute perfection. "You win, Sabrina," I whispered, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I cannot fight you anymore. I cannot fight a $500,000 syndicate debt, and I cannot fight Dad's shadow lenders. Aaron is gone, and being in this house just reminds me of everything I have lost. I am too tired to keep fighting." Sabrina let out a loud, triumphant laugh that echoed against the high ceilings of my kitchen. She walked over and patted my shoulder with a patronizing, heavy hand. "It is about time you realized your place, Fiona," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You were never strong enough to handle real pressure. Do not worry about a thing. Dad and Mom will handle the syndicate once the house is sold. We will make sure you do not end up completely on the street. I will text Dad and tell him you are cooperating." I just nodded, acting completely compliant. I told her I would bring the signed deed transfer paperwork to the Oak Ridge Country Club tomorrow night, just like Gordon wanted. Sabrina was so thrilled by her easy victory that she immediately dropped her fake sympathy. She told me she and Trevor were tired of the cramped guest wing. She announced that since the house was practically hers anyway, they were going to move their things into the master bedroom tonight. She actually started talking about tearing down Aaron's custom bookshelves and putting up new curtains. A white-hot spike of pure rage flared in my chest at the thought of those two criminals sleeping in the bed I had shared with my husband. But I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands until they nearly bled, swallowing my disgust. I needed her to feel completely comfortable and victorious. I needed her to drop her guard entirely. I told her the master suite was all hers. Sabrina smirked and skipped back down the hallway to start packing her cheap pink suitcases. The next morning, I woke up early and left the house before Sabrina or Trevor even stirred. I did not go to a lawyer's office or a bank. I drove straight to an upscale boutique in the downtown commercial district. I needed a dress for the charity gala tonight. As I walked through the racks of expensive silk and chiffon, I thought about all the family events I had attended over the last 34 years. My mother, Beverly, had always insisted on taking me shopping for major holidays and formal dinners. She always guided me toward the dullest muted colors on the racks. She dressed me in pale gray flat beige and washed out brown. She claimed those colors suited my complexion, but I knew the real reason. Beverly never wanted me to draw attention. Sabrina was the star of the family. Sabrina was the one who got to wear the ruby reds and the emerald greens to stand out in all the family photographs. Beverly wanted me to fade into the background so her golden child could shine the brightest. But today, I was shopping for a dress that commanded absolute unbreakable authority. I bypassed the muted colors and found a stunning, uncompromising black dress. It had sharp, clean lines and a silhouette that projected total power. I tried it on in the fitting room and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked dangerous. I looked like a woman who was no longer afraid of anything. Tonight I was dressing for a funeral. I was attending the ultimate death of my family's pristine public reputation. I paid for the dress and drove to a small, quiet coffee shop located just 2 miles down the road from the Oak Ridge Country Club. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a corner table, and opened my laptop. It was time to prepare the venue. The country club was a haven for wealthy, out-of-touch socialites, and their digital infrastructure reflected exactly that. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on floral arrangements and imported champagne, but they relied on a severely outdated basic commercial firewall to protect their internal networks. I used my cybersecurity skills to remotely access their unsecured audio-visual network. I sliced through their firewall in less than 12 minutes. I navigated through their internal directories until I located the presentation software running on the main computer in the grand ballroom. Gordon was going to use that exact system tonight to project his slides asking wealthy donors for money to fund his fake real estate expansion. I planted a highly specialized digital backdoor deep within the software. I wrote a script that would override all physical inputs, locking out the technicians at the sound booth. I tested my access from my mobile phone, sending a silent ping to the ballroom computer. The connection was flawless. I had complete total control over the massive projector screens and the main sound system. I was just closing my terminal window when my cell phone vibrated on the table. The caller ID showed a secure, restricted number. I answered it immediately, knowing it was Agent Bradley from the Federal Financial Crimes Division. "Fiona, we are good to go," Bradley said, his voice sharp and professional over the secure line. "The federal warrants are signed and sealed by the judge. We have a full tactical team mobilized and ready to move on Gordon Beverly and Sabrina for wire fraud and felony identity theft. But we have one specific problem." "What is the problem?" I asked, taking a calm sip of my coffee. "To make the wire fraud charges stick immediately, without giving Gordon's expensive corporate lawyers any room to stall, we need a triggering event," Bradley explained. "We need Gordon to publicly solicit funds while the offshore accounts are actively displayed or referenced. We need a direct public admission of the financial structure to trigger an immediate raid under the current warrant guidelines. Otherwise, he could claim the documents on Aaron's server were just theoretical drafts." I smiled, looking at the malicious payload I had just successfully uploaded to the country club server. The trap was perfectly set. The dominoes were all lined up, waiting for a single push. "Do not worry about Gordon's public solicitation," I told the federal agent, my voice steady and completely devoid of doubt. "Have your tactical team in position at the Oak Ridge Country Club by exactly 8 o'clock tonight. Stage them in the main lobby and wait for my signal. I will give you the public confession you need." "Are you sure about this?" Fiona Bradley asked, a hint of genuine concern in his voice. "You are walking into a room filled with their friends and their allies. It is going to be incredibly volatile." "I am absolutely certain," I replied, closing my laptop and sliding it into my bag. "They think they broke me. They think I am walking into that ballroom to hand over my house and beg for mercy. They have no idea what is coming." I ended the call and walked out of the coffee shop into the fading afternoon sunlight. I drove back home to put on my new black dress. The final act was about to begin. The sun had completely set by the time I pulled my car into the sprawling circular driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The venue was bathed in golden light, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth and prestige. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried back and forth, opening the doors of luxury sedans and sports cars. I handed my keys to a young valet and stepped onto the pristine cobblestone walkway. The crisp night air brushed against my bare shoulders, but I did not shiver. I felt perfectly insulated by the armor of my own absolute certainty. I smoothed the fabric of my sharp black dress. For my entire life, Beverly had forced me to wear dull, muted colors so I would never draw attention away from Sabrina. Tonight, I was wearing a dress that commanded the entire room. I was walking into their glittering sanctuary not as a broken widow, but as the architect of their total destruction. I walked through the grand double doors and stepped into the main lobby. The space was completely transformed for the Family Legacy Charity Gala. Massive floral arrangements cascaded down the sweeping marble staircases. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the arriving guests. I kept my posture completely straight and my chin held high. I did not have to wait long for the first obstacle. Beverly was standing near the entrance to the main ballroom, greeting high-net-worth donors with a practiced, dazzling smile. She wore a sparkling emerald gown paid for by the very criminal syndicate she was desperately trying to appease. She spotted me almost immediately. Her artificial smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She left a pair of wealthy banking executives mid-sentence and marched straight toward me, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging painfully into my skin. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests would not hear. "I told you to bring the deed transfer paperwork to the back office, not parade around the lobby in that ridiculous dress. Get out of sight before you ruin everything." I calmly reached down and pried her fingers off my arm one by one. "I brought exactly what I promised Beverly," I replied, my voice completely smooth. "But I am not going to any back office. I am going to the main ballroom." Beverly turned purple with rage. She frantically waved her hands, signaling for the head of security. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit quickly approached us, looking stern and professional. "Remove this woman from the premises immediately," Beverly ordered, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my chest. She is my daughter, but she has been suffering from a severe mental breakdown since her husband died. She is an unstable, grieving widow, and she is here to cause a scene and harass our donors. Escort her out of the building right now." The head of security reached out to grab my shoulder, but I did not take a single step back. Instead, I smoothly reached into my small black clutch purse and pulled out a heavy, laminated badge wallet. Agent Bradley had given it to me just hours ago. I flipped it open, revealing the gleaming gold shield of the Federal Financial Crimes Division alongside a signed federal mandate granting me full unrestricted access to the premises as an acting technical liaison for an active federal operation. I held it up right in front of the security director's face. "I am operating under direct federal authority." I told him, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "If you touch me or attempt to restrict my movement in any way, you will be arrested for obstructing an active federal investigation." The tactical team is staged exactly 1 mile down the road and they are monitoring my location. Step aside. The head of security looked at the federal badge, then looked at my unwavering expression. The color completely drained from his face. He immediately took 3 large steps backward, clearing my path. "I am so sorry, Mom," he stammered, lowering his head. "Please proceed," Beverly gasped, clutching her diamond necklace as if she had just been physically struck. "You cannot do this," she choked out, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "What did you just show him?" I did not bother to answer her. I simply smiled a cold, ruthless smile and glided right past her, leaving her standing frozen in the lobby. I stepped through the heavy golden doors and entered the grand ballroom. The space was packed with hundreds of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city. Politicians, real estate moguls, and private equity investors mingled under the glittering lights, completely unaware that they were financing a massive criminal enterprise. As I walked down the grand staircase, heads began to turn. My sharp black dress and my quiet, commanding presence cut through the room like a blade. I ignored the whispers and the curious stares, keeping my focus entirely on my targets. I spotted Sabrina first. She was standing near a towering champagne pyramid, holding a crystal flute and talking to a group of elderly, wealthy philanthropists. She was wearing a delicate, modest white dress, clearly designed to make her look innocent and vulnerable. I watched her play the role of the tragic single mother to absolute perfection. She wiped a fake tear from her eye and placed a hand over her heart, telling the donors a fabricated sob story about how hard it was to raise baby Mason alone after the sudden tragic death of her beloved brother-in-law. The wealthy donors nodded sympathetically, reaching into their tailored suit jackets to pull out their checkbooks. She was actively using my dead husband's memory to solicit cash donations right in front of my eyes. A wave of pure disgust washed over me, but I kept my emotions completely locked down. Across the room, Gordon was working the heavy hitters. He stood in the center of a circle of prominent bank executives holding a glass of scotch and laughing a deep, booming laugh. He projected the absolute perfect image of a flawless, trustworthy patriarch. He was shaking hands, clapping men on the shoulder, and talking grandly about trust, community development, and family values. He was selling them the illusion of a profitable real estate expansion fund, deliberately concealing the fact that every single dollar they invested would be funneled directly to an offshore shell company to pay off a violent sports gambling syndicate. He looked so incredibly smug, so perfectly secure in his carefully constructed kingdom of lies. He thought he had completely defeated me. He thought the forged guarantor contract had permanently chained me to his sinking ship. He had no idea that his entire empire was about 10 minutes away from total annihilation. I did not approach them. I did not need to scream or make a scene to get my point across. I had a much more sophisticated method of execution. I kept to the shadows along the edge of the ballroom, maneuvering quietly through the dense crowd until I reached the back of the room. Elevated on a small platform overlooking the entire ballroom was the main audio-visual control booth. The technician was a young guy wearing headphones, staring blankly at a mixing console and a primary presentation computer. This was the exact machine I had hacked from the coffee shop earlier that afternoon. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the platform. The technician took off his headphones and looked at me with a confused expression. "I am sorry, miss," he said, holding up a hand. "Guests are not allowed up here." I gave him my most polite professional smile. "Gordon asked me to bring you an updated data drive for the main presentation," I lied smoothly, pointing to the main computer. "He said there was a last-minute change to the donor slide deck." The technician sighed, looking annoyed but compliant. "Just plug it into the side port," he muttered, turning his attention back to his audio mixer. I stepped up to the main console. I did not plug in a physical drive. I simply reached out and tapped the keyboard, executing a rapid sequence of shortcut commands I had memorized. I activated the malicious payload I had planted in their unsecured network hours ago. The screen flickered twice and then went completely black. A small green confirmation window popped up in the corner of the monitor. The digital backdoor slammed shut, locking the system entirely. I quickly engaged the administrative lockout protocol, disabling the physical keyboard and the mouse. I stripped the technician of all his manual control privileges. The system was now entirely slave to the secure application running on my mobile phone. The technician finally noticed the black screen and frantically started clicking his mouse. "Hey, what did you just do?" He panicked, slamming his fingers against the keyboard. "The system is completely frozen. I cannot access the presentation files." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with rising panic. I stepped back from the console, looking out over the massive, glittering ballroom. I could see Gordon making his way toward the main stage, preparing to deliver his keynote speech to the wealthy donors. He was smiling, adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely ready to ask them for millions of dollars to fund his criminal debts. I pulled my cell phone out of my black clutch purse. The screen displayed a blinking red countdown timer securely linked to the main projector system overlooking the stage. I looked at the panicked technician and offered him a calm, chilling smile. "Do not worry about the presentation," I told him, my voice steady and cold. "It is going to run exactly as I programmed it." I tapped the screen of my phone, initiating the final sequence. The countdown began. The silent timer on my screen ticked down from 60 seconds. Out in the grand ballroom, the massive crystal chandeliers slowly dimmed to a warm theatrical glow, signaling the start of the evening's main event. I stood perfectly still on the elevated platform of the control booth, watching the wealthy elite take their seats at the dozens of circular tables below. The clinking of expensive silverware and the hum of privileged conversation faded into an expectant silence. The live orchestra stopped playing. A single brilliant spotlight pierced the dim room, illuminating the center of the massive stage. Gordon walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, looking exactly like the savior of suburban real estate he pretended to be. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His silver hair was swept back, and he wore a warm, trustworthy smile that could easily convince anyone to hand over their entire life savings. Gordon adjusted the microphone on the podium and looked out over the sea of deep pockets. He started his keynote speech with a masterful display of charismatic manipulation. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he began, his deep voice echoing richly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are gathered here to celebrate something much larger than commerce or real estate development. We are here to celebrate the unbreakable bonds of community and the enduring strength of our loved ones." He swept his hand toward the front row where Beverly and Sabrina were sitting. Beverly wiped a completely fabricated tear from her eye, playing the part of the devoted, grieving matriarch. Sabrina held baby Mason on her lap, looking like the tragic, vulnerable single mother, desperately needing protection. My stomach twisted with pure disgust as I watched them leverage an innocent child to prime the donors for their impending financial pitch. Gordon continued, seamlessly moving into the core of his massive fraud. "Tonight I am officially launching the Family First Real Estate Expansion Fund," he announced, projecting a slide of a beautiful, fictitious architectural rendering onto the massive screens behind him. "This fund is built on the fundamental belief that true wealth is not measured in profit margins, but in the legacy we leave for our children. Trust is our currency. Blood bonds are our foundation. By investing with us tonight, you are not just building houses in new neighborhoods. You are securing generational wealth and protecting the families of this great city." He paused, placing a hand over his heart, and lowered his voice, adopting a tone of solemn, fabricated grief. As many of you know, our family recently suffered a devastating, heartbreaking loss. My brilliant son-in-law, Aaron, passed away suddenly, leaving my brave daughter, Sabrina, to raise her child alone in a difficult world. He was actively publicly framing my dead husband as an adulterer in front of hundreds of people, just to squeeze sympathy cash from these investors. He was exploiting Aaron's tragic death to launder money to a violent offshore sports gambling syndicate. I looked down at my phone. The red countdown timer hit 10 seconds. I gripped the smooth metal railing of the control booth platform. Gordon was ramping up to his final call to action, asking the bankers and politicians in the room to open their checkbooks and commit to his fraudulent fund. 9 seconds. 8 seconds. 7 seconds. I watched the young audio-visual technician beside me staring blankly at his locked monitor, completely unaware of the absolute digital devastation that was about to hit the room. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. The payload executed with flawless, terrifying precision. Every single electronic system tied to the ballroom network was hijacked simultaneously. The smooth background music playing through the peripheral speakers cut out with a sharp screech of static. The massive teleprompters at the base of the stage, which Gordon was using to read his fraudulent speech, suddenly went pitch black. The main projector screens behind him flickered wildly before displaying a massive blinking red timer. Then came the sound that sealed their fate. The heavy solid oak double doors leading out of the grand ballroom were equipped with commercial magnetic security locks. I had rewritten their control protocols during my hack at the coffee shop. A loud, simultaneous mechanical clack echoed around the perimeter of the room as every single door locked automatically. I had effectively trapped hundreds of the city's most powerful people inside a luxurious cage with a criminal. A wave of confused murmurs washed over the audience. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking around at the locked doors and the blinking red screens. Gordon tapped his microphone, trying to maintain his suave composure. "It seems we are experiencing a minor technical difficulty," he chuckled smoothly, flashing his charismatic smile at the front row. "Please bear with us while our technicians resolve the issue." He looked up toward the control booth and made a sharp, angry cutting motion with his hand, signaling the technician to fix the screens immediately. The young tech was frantically smashing his fingers against his keyboard, but the administrative lockout protocol I had initiated held strong. He was completely powerless to stop what was happening. It was time. I tucked my phone into my clutch purse and walked down the short flight of stairs from the control booth to the main floor. The ballroom was completely silent save for the nervous whispers of the trapped guests. I stepped out of the shadows at the back of the room and moved into the center aisle. My sharp black dress caught the edge of the stage lighting. Every step I took resonated loudly against the polished hardwood floor, my tall black heels clicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sea of wealthy donors parted for me. People began to turn in their seats, their expensive jewelry catching the light as they craned their necks to see who was disrupting the exclusive event. Gasps of recognition rippled through the crowd as I moved further into the light. These were people who had attended my wedding years ago. These were people who had sent me expensive condolence cards just 3 weeks prior. They knew me as the quiet, unladylike, computer-obsessed daughter who always stayed in the background. They knew me as the weak, grieving widow. They did not know the woman walking down the aisle right now. I walked with my spine perfectly straight and my shoulders pulled back, radiating an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. I was not shrinking away. I was not hiding. I stared straight ahead, locking my eyes entirely on my father standing on the stage. I saw the exact moment the realization hit my family. Beverly, who had been sitting at the front table with a serene expression, suddenly clutched her diamond necklace. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and horrified under the bright stage lights. She tried to stand up, but her legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank heavily back into her velvet chair. Sabrina gripped the edge of the table, her eyes wide with mounting terror, as she realized I was not at home, shivering in the dark, signing over the deed to my house. Trevor, who had managed to sneak into the back of the room wearing an ill-fitting borrowed suit, looked around nervously at the locked doors, realizing he had absolutely nowhere to run. I reached the front row of tables. A young usher wearing a black vest and a gold name tag was standing frozen near the side of the stage, clutching a wireless spare microphone. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and firmly pulled the microphone from his trembling hands. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the main stage. Gordon took a step back, his charismatic smile completely vanishing into a mask of pure panic. The stage lights were incredibly bright, blindingly hot against my skin, but I did not blink. I stood directly in front of the man who had raised me, the man who had lied to me, and the man who had tried to destroy my life to pay off a violent mob debt. "Fiona, what do you think you are doing?" Gordon hissed through gritted teeth, keeping his voice low enough that his own lapel microphone would not pick it up. "You are making a massive mistake. Hand me that microphone right now and walk off this stage before I ruin you completely." I did not hand him the microphone. I did not take a single step backward. The height difference between us meant absolutely nothing, because in this moment I held all the power in the universe. I raised the microphone to my lips. I looked out at the sea of terrified, wealthy investors, the corrupt politicians, and the greedy socialites. Then I looked right back into my father's cold, panicking eyes. "Let us talk about family legacy." "Gordon," I said, my voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing with crystal-clear precision across the silent, locked ballroom. "Let us talk about how you really fund it." I reached into my small black purse, pulled out my cell phone, and pressed the final execution button on my screen. The massive projector screens behind my father flickered violently. The beautiful, fake architectural rendering of his suburban development project warped and dissolved into digital static. Gordon turned his head, looking over his shoulder in confusion. The crowd of elite investors fell into a hushed, bewildered silence. Then the static cleared. In brilliant high definition, the screens displayed the internal banking ledger of the Cayman Islands Shell Company. The harsh green and black numbers illuminated Gordon's horrified face. I held the microphone firmly in my hand, standing just a few feet away from the man who had forged my signature. "Welcome to the Real Family First Expansion Fund," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. "Let us take a look at the actual investments you are being asked to make tonight." I tapped my phone screen and the projected image zoomed in on a specific series of offshore wire transfers. I directed the attention of every banker, politician, and socialite in the room to the front table. "You all know my sister Sabrina," I continued, pointing directly at her. "She just told you a beautiful, tragic story about being a struggling single mother. What she did not tell you is that she is a degenerate sports gambler who owes a violent, illegal betting syndicate $350,000. Sabrina let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The wealthy donors sitting at her table immediately physically pulled away from her as if she were contagious. I swiped my screen again, loading the next piece of evidence. The projectors flashed a scanned copy of my parents' home equity line of credit, explicitly tying their personal affluent estate directly to the shadow lenders. "And these are the loving, supportive parents," I said, gesturing to Gordon, who was now trembling with rage. "They did not want their golden child to face the consequences of her crimes, so they co-signed her mob debt. They mortgaged their country club lifestyle to a criminal enterprise. They are entirely broke. They brought you all here tonight to solicit millions of dollars under the guise of community development, but every single check you write will be funneled directly to an offshore syndicate to save their own skins." The ballroom erupted. The polite silence was instantly replaced by a wave of furious, outraged shouts. Bank executives began pulling out their phones to cancel checks. Politicians stood up demanding answers, realizing their political campaigns were suddenly tied to a massive public fraud. Gordon realized his entire empire was burning to ash in front of his eyes. His charismatic facade shattered completely. The polished, wealthy patriarch disappeared, leaving only a desperate, cornered criminal. He turned purple with sheer, unadulterated rage. He let out a guttural roar and lunged across the stage directly at me, his hands outstretched to rip the microphone from my grasp. I did not panic. I did not even flinch. I had spent my entire life bracing for his emotional attacks, and I was not about to be intimidated by his physical ones. I simply sidestepped his clumsy, desperate assault effortlessly. Gordon stumbled forward, his heavy frame crashing into the podium. The microphone stand tipped over and hit the floor with a loud screech of feedback. He looked incredibly pathetic, grasping at the edge of the stage to keep himself from falling into the front row. He scrambled to his knees, gasping for breath, his custom tuxedo wrinkled and ruined. Down in the audience, Beverly jumped to her feet. She was frantically waving her arms desperately, trying to do damage control to save whatever shred of high society status she thought she had left. "Do not listen to her," Beverly screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly across the chaotic room. "She is insane. She is completely off her medication. My daughter is having a severe grief-induced mental breakdown because her husband just died. She does not know what she is saying. This is all a sick psychotic delusion brought on by extreme trauma. Someone please call an ambulance for her." She was trying to use the oldest trick in her playbook. She was trying to gaslight hundreds of people into believing I was simply a hysterical woman making up crazy stories. I stood tall over my father, looking down at my mother in the front row. I raised my microphone again. My voice was absolute ice, cutting through the noise of the panicking crowd and silencing my mother's shrieks entirely. "If I am delusional, Beverly, then let us look at the final piece of evidence," I said. I pressed the last button on my mobile device. The massive screen shifted one final time. The crowd gasped audibly. Displayed above us were the official digital security logs from the intensive care unit of the local hospital. Next to the logs was the drafted formal criminal complaint to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, bearing my late husband's official corporate seal and his digital signature. I looked out at the horrified crowd, ensuring every single person understood the absolute depravity of my family. "My husband Aaron was an enterprise security executive," I explained, my voice ringing with total, undeniable authority. "He uncovered their identity theft and their forged loan agreements a week before his fatal aneurysm. He was drafting this exact federal lawsuit to have Gordon and Sabrina arrested for felony wire fraud. He was going to expose them to the authorities to protect me from their criminal debts." I turned my body slightly, focusing entirely on my father, who was still kneeling on the stage, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I lowered my voice, but the microphone carried every single deadly syllable into the very corners of the locked ballroom. "You knew he was going to expose you," I said to Gordon. "You knew he was going to destroy you. So when his brain aneurysm ruptured, you did not mourn him. You went to the hospital while he was in a coma. You stole his mobile phone from his medical gown. You pressed a dying man's thumb against a biometric scanner to forge a $50,000 offshore clinic receipt and a fake will to steal my house. You thought you could use his corpse to save yourself from the syndicate." The entire ballroom went dead silent again. The sheer, horrific cruelty of the act hung in the air, suffocating the room. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in absolute horror. The bank executives stared at Gordon with pure, unmasked revulsion. "You did not just steal from me," I announced, the final blow landing with the force of a falling building. "You stole from a dying man on life support to pay off the mob." In the back of the room near the entrance, Trevor finally realized exactly what was happening. Sabrina's deadbeat ex-boyfriend saw the offshore logs and the drafted FBI documents on the projector screen and knew the violent gambling syndicate was about to be completely exposed to federal authorities. He knew the shadow lenders would come looking for anyone tied to Sabrina's debt, and he refused to go down with her. He panicked. He shoved his way past a group of terrified investors, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses, and bolted straight for the grand double doors leading to the lobby. He grabbed the heavy brass handles and yanked them with all his brute strength. The doors did not budge. The magnetic security locks I had hacked from the coffee shop held absolutely firm, sealing the ballroom tight. Trevor slammed his shoulder against the heavy wood, desperately trying to break through, but he was completely trapped inside the room with the rest of the criminals. He spun around, looking like a trapped animal, his eyes darting frantically, looking for another exit, and then everyone in the grand ballroom heard it. Over the quiet, panicked breathing of the trapped guests, a new distinct sound emerged. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoing from the marble lobby outside. The sound grew louder and louder, marching directly toward the locked doors with absolute, unrelenting purpose. The federal agents had arrived to collect their targets. The heavy double doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club ballroom did not just open. They were violently breached. A loud mechanical crack echoed through the room as the magnetic locks I had hacked were overridden by a master code from the outside. The heavy wooden doors flew inward, hitting the walls with a deafening crash. A specialized tactical unit from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into the glittering room. They were wearing dark Kevlar vests, clearly marked with bright yellow letters. The contrast between the armed federal agents and the room full of people wearing diamond necklaces and custom tuxedos was absolutely staggering. The wealthy donors who had just been sitting politely sipping champagne screamed and scrambled out of the way. Trevor was the first one to go down. He had been pounding uselessly against the exit doors just seconds before. When the doors swung open, he tried to push past the first wave of agents. Two massive officers grabbed him by the shoulders, spun him around, and slammed him face first into a table of crystal champagne flutes. The glass shattered everywhere as they wrenched his arms behind his back and slapped heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists. Trevor shouted profanities, but the agents ignored him completely, moving with absolute military precision. Agent Bradley walked through the center aisle right down the exact same path I had taken just moments before. He did not look at the panicking politicians or the hiding bank executives. He kept his eyes locked dead on the main stage where my family was standing, frozen in absolute terror. "Secure the stage." Bradley barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. 4 armed agents rushed up the carpeted steps. My father Gordon instinctively put his hands up, backing away until his shoulders hit the massive projection screen that was still displaying his offshore banking logs. A federal agent grabbed Gordon by the arms, twisting them behind his back. The sharp click of the metal cuffs locking around my father's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Down in the front row, my mother Beverly was hyperventilating. She clutched her emerald gown, stepping backward and bumping into her velvet chair. "Do not touch me," she shrieked as a female agent approached her. "I am a prominent member of this community and you are making a massive mistake. I demand to call the club president." The agent did not hesitate. She grabbed Beverly by the wrists and secured them tightly. My mother, the woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over her pristine public image, was now standing in front of her country club friends in handcuffs, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Then there was Sabrina. My golden child sister had spent 29 years manipulating everyone around her with fake tears and manufactured innocence. When 2 agents approached her, she went straight for her favorite weapon. She dropped to her knees on the expensive ballroom carpet, right in front of the stage. She began sobbing hysterically, clutching her face and pleading with the officers. "Please, you do not understand," Sabrina cried, forcing huge wet tears out of her eyes. "I am a victim here. I am just a single mother trying to survive. My husband died and I was forced into this by violent people. I have a baby and you cannot take me away from my son." She looked up at the federal agents with her wide, perfectly practiced, tragic eyes. In the past, that exact look had gotten her out of massive credit card debt, failed rent payments, and countless legal troubles. My parents had always melted the second she started crying. But these were federal financial crime investigators. They had spent months tracking millions of dollars of laundered mob money. They were completely and utterly immune to her golden child manipulation. An agent from Child Protective Services stepped forward and gently but firmly took baby Mason from Sabrina. The agent assured her the child would be placed in a safe, secure temporary foster environment far away from the criminal syndicate. Sabrina shrieked, reaching out for the baby she had just been using as a fundraising prop. "Stand up right now," the federal agent ordered, grabbing Sabrina by the elbows and hauling her to her feet. "You are under arrest for felony wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." She clamped the handcuffs onto Sabrina, silencing her fake sobbing instantly. Sabrina looked around the room, desperately searching for our parents to bail her out, but Gordon and Beverly were already being marched toward the exit. I stood completely still on the edge of the stage, watching the absolute destruction of the toxic hierarchy that had suffocated me for my entire life. Agent Bradley walked up to the stage and gave me a single respectful nod. The operation was a flawless success. As the agents began to lead Gordon down the stairs, my father stopped and dug his heels into the carpet. He twisted his body around to look at me. His charismatic mask was completely gone, replaced by the face of a desperate, ruined man. His silver hair was a mess, and his custom tuxedo was violently wrinkled. He glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are a monster, Fiona!" Gordon screamed at me, his face turning a dark, angry purple. His voice cracked with rage, echoing across the silent, terrified ballroom. "We gave you everything, and we are your blood. You are ruining this family. You are destroying your own legacy over a piece of property." Every single wealthy investor in the room turned to look at me, waiting to see how I would respond to my father's furious public condemnation. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell back. I walked slowly across the stage until I was standing just 2 feet away from the man who had forged my signature to sell me to the mob. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of any fear or intimidation. "I did not ruin the family, Gordon," I said, my voice steady and cold, carrying clearly through the room. "I just provided the audit." Gordon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sheer clinical finality of my words completely shattered whatever defiance he had left. He sagged against the federal agents, the fight completely draining out of his body. They pulled him forward, marching him down the center aisle of the ballroom. I watched as my father, my mother, and my sister were paraded through the crowd of their elite peers like common street criminals. The wealthy donors they had tried to scam actively stepped away from them, pulling their expensive coats and dresses back to avoid brushing against my family as they passed. It was the ultimate social execution. But the federal agents were not quite finished cleaning house. Agent Bradley pulled a piece of paper from his tactical vest and keyed his radio. "We have one more target in the room," Bradley announced, his voice projecting over the murmurs of the stunned crowd. "Secure the perimeter right now." Several agents moved away from the main exit and waded directly into the thickest part of the crowd. The wealthy socialites parted like the sea, frantically trying to get out of the way of the federal officers. The agents surrounded a small, circular table near the back of the room. Sitting there, trying desperately to hide his face behind a crystal water glass, was my father's corrupt local family lawyer. This was the same man who had helped Gordon file the illegal emergency injunction to freeze my bank accounts just 24 hours ago. He was the man who had legitimized the forged will and tried to force me onto the street. The agents grabbed him by the collar of his expensive suit and hauled him to his feet. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and filing false legal documents," an agent stated loudly, slapping the cuffs onto his wrists. The lawyer sputtered and protested, claiming attorney-client privilege, but the agents ignored him entirely. They dragged him out of the crowd, pushing him forward to join my family in the lobby. I stood on the stage, looking out over the empty center aisle. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were propped wide open, letting the cool, crisp night air flow into the stuffy, glittering room. The flashing red and blue lights from the dozens of federal cruisers parked outside the country club reflected off the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. In less than 20 minutes, the entire criminal network had been completely and utterly dismantled in one fell swoop. The shadow lenders had lost their money launderers. The corrupt legal system had lost its inside man, and my family had lost their freedom, their reputation, and their ability to ever hurt me again. I took a deep, clean breath of the fresh night air. The war was officially over. Now it was time to collect the spoils. The days that followed the tactical raid at the Oak Ridge Country Club were a master class in swift, absolute justice. The local news stations ran the story non-stop for weeks on end. The media headlines did not focus on a grieving widow losing her mind to trauma, as my mother had so desperately tried to claim. Instead, they focused entirely on a prominent, trusted real estate developer operating a massive offshore money laundering ring right under the noses of the city elite. The high society crowd who had attended the gala treated my parents like a highly infectious disease. The country club board of directors held an emergency meeting the very next morning and permanently revoked Gordon and Beverly's exclusive memberships. But that social execution was just the very beginning of their total nightmare. The federal government moves with a terrifying, unrelenting speed when it comes to prosecuting major financial crimes. Within 48 hours, the federal agents seized every single one of my parents' remaining assets. Their personal bank accounts, their luxury vehicles, and their hidden investment portfolios were completely locked down and confiscated. Because my father had explicitly tied his home equity line of credit directly to the violent gambling syndicate, the federal bank foreclosed on their pristine suburban mansion immediately. My mother, Beverly, went from wearing sparkling emerald gowns and sipping imported champagne to sitting in a bleak concrete holding cell wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit. She had spent 34 years caring only about her flawless public image and manipulating everyone around her to maintain it. Now her unedited, tear-stained mugshot was being broadcast across every television screen and news website in the state. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Sabrina fared even worse in the aftermath. For her entire 29 years on this earth, she had managed to cry her way out of every single consequence. She honestly believed she could simply bat her eyes, shed a few strategic tears, and manipulate the federal judge during her arraignment, just like she had manipulated our parents. She stood in the federal courtroom and tried to play the victim card one last time, claiming she was a helpless mother forced into the identity theft by the threatening shadow lenders. But Agent Bradley and the federal prosecutors brought the absolute mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously provided. They played the audio recordings for the judge to hear. They showed the offshore wire transfers mapping every stolen dollar. And they presented the brutal hospital security logs proving she and my father had conspired to rob a dying man while he was on life support. The federal judge did not show her a single ounce of pity. My golden child sister, the woman who thought she was entitled to steal my home, was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit extortion. As the armed bailiffs led her away in heavy metal handcuffs, she looked back at me from across the silent courtroom. She did not look smug or vibrant or superior anymore. She looked completely hollowed out and terrified. There were no enabling parents left to bail her out of trouble, and no amount of fake crying could ever unlock a federal prison door. The only truly innocent victim in my family's massive web of toxic lies was baby Mason. When the agents from Child Protective Services took him from the gala that night, I made absolutely certain they knew the full extent of the dangerous syndicate ties his biological parents had recklessly created. Trevor, the violent deadbeat father who had tried to flee the locked ballroom, was swept up by the FBI and locked away on outstanding warrants and racketeering conspiracy charges. Mason was safely and permanently placed in the care of a wonderful, fully vetted foster family who lived completely outside the poisonous sphere of my parents' influence. I visited him a few times once the legal dust began to settle. Seeing him playing happily in a warm, safe environment, without being used as a prop to solicit sympathy donations, gave me a profound, incredible sense of peace. I knew I could not raise him myself. I was building an entirely new life from the ground up, and Mason deserved a fresh, clean start, completely detached from the dark shadows of my family's extensive crimes. But I utterly refused to let him grow up unprotected or vulnerable. I used my own personal funds to establish a completely secure, legally bulletproof blind trust for his future college education and medical needs. I worked closely with the best estate lawyers in the city to ensure the trust was completely ironclad. I put in explicit, unbreakable legal clauses that dictated neither Sabrina nor Gordon nor Beverly could ever access a single cent of that money under any circumstances whatsoever. Mason would have the strong financial security he needed to build a good life when he turned 18, but my toxic family would never be able to weaponize his future or his finances. I had finally permanently broken their generational cycle of abuse. With my family firmly behind bars serving their sentences, I turned my attention back to cleaning up the digital wreckage they had tried to leave behind in my life. Armed with the official federal indictment and the full cooperation of the Financial Crimes Division, clearing my own name was a surprisingly swift process. The shadow lenders from the illegal sports gambling syndicate had been completely dismantled and arrested during the massive FBI sweep. Because of this, the fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan attached to my forged signature was entirely nullified and wiped completely from my credit history. I filed the final legal paperwork with the county clerk's office, permanently securing the primary deed to my $950,000 home. The house was unconditionally, safely, and legally mine forever. But my ultimate victory extended far beyond just protecting my personal property. The story of how a single grieving cybersecurity analyst had uncovered a massive offshore money laundering operation and handed a flawless prosecution package directly to the FBI sent massive shockwaves through the corporate financial technology sector. My professional reputation skyrocketed overnight. I was no longer just a quiet senior analyst grinding away in a background corporate cubicle. I was the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a ruthless criminal empire with nothing but a laptop and pure determination. I leveraged that newfound industry prestige immediately. I formally resigned from my corporate banking job and opened my own elite independent cybersecurity firm specializing in high-level corporate asset protection and digital forensics. Within my very first month of operation, I had secured massive lucrative security contracts with three of the largest banking institutions in the country. I was answering to absolutely no one but myself, building a highly successful business empire constructed entirely on truth, logic, and unyielding integrity. 6 months after the federal raid, I stood in the bright kitchen of my beautiful four-bedroom home. The house was perfectly quiet and calm. The heavy, oppressive energy that Sabrina and Trevor had brought into these walls was completely gone, washed away by time, and the absolute certainty of my hard-won safety. I walked over to the smart home control panel on the wall and adjusted the temperature, filling the entire house with deep, comforting warmth. I poured myself a cup of dark, rich coffee and walked through the living room, opening the heavy glass doors leading out to the back patio. I stepped out into the crisp morning air and sat down on one of the comfortable woven lounge chairs overlooking my manicured green backyard. There were no pastel balloon arches, no fake country club relatives, and no forced smiles. There was only the gentle rustle of the morning wind through the large oak trees and the sound of birds singing in the early sunlight. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, letting the beautiful, peaceful silence wash over me. I reached into the pocket of my soft gray cardigan and pulled out a small framed photograph of Aaron. It was my absolute favorite picture of him taken on a hiking trip we had gone on just a year after we were married. His bright blue eyes were crinkling at the corners, and he was wearing that genuine warm smile that had made me fall in love with him in the very beginning. I ran my thumb gently over the smooth glass frame. For a long time, my grief over losing him so suddenly had felt like a heavy iron anchor dragging me down into a dark, crushing ocean. But looking at his smile now, the heavy, suffocating weight was completely gone. It had been replaced by a powerful, enduring warmth that filled my entire chest. Aaron had spent his final days on Earth fighting relentlessly in the shadows to protect me, and I had picked up his sword to finish the battle. We had won. I looked out over the bright green grass of my backyard, feeling the morning sunlight touch my face. I had not just survived the unimaginable cruelty of the people who were supposed to love and protect me. I had completely and utterly defeated them. I had successfully avenged the man who meant everything to me. I had reclaimed my home, my career, and my entire future. For 34 years, I had been the family scapegoat, the constant disappointment, and the silent victim. But sitting on my back porch in the quiet, absolute safety of my own beautiful kingdom, I finally understood my true, immeasurable worth. I had fought through the absolute darkest depths of grief and betrayal, and I had emerged completely unbreakable. And for the very first time in my entire life, I had found ultimate absolute peace. One of the greatest lessons from this story is that truth may be delayed, but it is incredibly powerful when combined with courage and patience. Fiona was betrayed by the very people who should have protected her, her own family. They manipulated her grief, forged legal documents, stole her identity, and tried to take away everything she and her husband had built together. Instead of reacting with anger or seeking revenge blindly, she chose to remain calm, gather evidence, and expose the truth through lawful means. The story reminds us that toxic people often rely on fear lies and intimidation to control others. They expect their victims to give up, stay silent, or believe they have no way out. But real strength is not found in shouting the loudest or striking back impulsively. It comes from thinking clearly under pressure, standing firm in your values, and refusing to let injustice define your future. Another important lesson is that trust should be earned, not assumed. Blood relationships do not automatically guarantee loyalty or love. Sometimes the people closest to us can become the source of our deepest pain. In those moments, protecting your peace, your integrity, and your future is not selfish, it is necessary. Setting boundaries and walking away from manipulation are acts of self-respect, not betrayal. Finally, the story teaches that justice is most meaningful when it restores dignity instead of simply seeking revenge. Fiona did not destroy her family out of hatred. She exposed their crimes because they had chosen greed over honesty and exploitation over love. Her victory was not measured by what she took from them, but by reclaiming her own life, honoring her husband's memory, and proving that truth will always outlast deception. No matter how overwhelming betrayal may seem, integrity, patience, and courage have a way of turning even the darkest chapter into the beginning of a stronger future.